All right, hello everybody. I think the chat is working this time. That's a good sign. So we're going to be reading Exiting the Vampire's Castle by Mark Fisher. I don't think we have a recording of Mark Fisher reading this time, so I pre-recorded myself reading it. It should be nice smooth read, knocking on wood. And then we're going to do another lecture about the essay. This one was a little bit weird because going back to it, I wasn't actually as interested in the vampire castle as I thought it would be. There's actually a lot going on in this paper, as we're going to find out here in just a minute. So the lecture is going to be a little bit less maybe structured than the last one. It kind of hops around a little bit. Up my mic, give me a sec. Is that better? Okay, so it's going to be a little bit different of an essay this time, or excuse me, a lecture this time, because I'm going to be hopping around a little bit more than last time. There was a lot I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to still kind of keep it manageable, so it just ends up being a little, I don't know, we'll see how it goes. Yeah, we're going to enter the Huxley Castle. Okay, welcome everybody. Let's get this show on the road. Exiting the Vampire Castle by Mark Fisher. This summer, I seriously considered withdrawing from any involvement in politics. Exhausted through overwork, incapable of productive activity, I found myself drifting through social networks, feeling my depression and exhaustion increasing. Left-wing Twitter can often be a miserable, dispiriting zone. Earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms, in which particular left-wing identifying figures were called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable, but nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue, the stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. The reason I didn't speak out on any of these incidents, I'm ashamed to say, was fear. The bullies were in another part of the playground. I didn't want to attract their attention to me. The open savagery of these exchanges was accompanied by something more pervasive, and for that reason perhaps more debilitating, an atmosphere of snarky resentment. The most frequent object of this resentment is Owen Jones, and the attacks on Jones, the person most responsible for raising class consciousness in the UK in the last few years, were one of the reasons I was so dejected. If this is what happens to a left-winger who is actually succeeding in taking the struggle to the center ground of British life, why would anyone want to follow him into the mainstream? Is the only way to avoid this drip feed of abuse to remain in a position of infinite marginality? One of the things that broke me out of this depressive stupor was going to the People's Assembly in Ipswich, near where I live. The People's Assembly had been greeted with the usual sneers and snarks. This was, we were told, a useless stunt, in which media leftists, including Jones, were aggrandizing themselves in yet another display of top-down celebrity culture. What actually happened at the assembly in Ipswich was very different to this caricature. The first half of the evening, culminating in a rousing speech by Owen Jones, was certainly led by the top-table speakers, but the second half of the meeting saw working-class activists from all over Suffolk talking to each other, supporting one another, and sharing experiences and strategies. Far from being another example of hierarchical leftism, the People's Assembly was an example of how the vertical can be combined with the horizontal. Media power and charisma could draw people who hadn't previously been to a political meeting into a room, where they could talk and strategize with seasoned activists. The atmosphere was anti-racist and anti-sexist, but refreshingly free of the paralyzing feeling of guilt and suspicion which hangs over left-wing Twitter like an acrid, stifling fog. Then there was Russell Brand. I've long been an admirer of Brand, one of the few big-name comedians on the current scene to come from a working-class background. Over the last few years, there has been a gradual but remorseless embourgeoisement of television comedy, with preposterous, ultra-posh nincompoop Michael McIntyre and a dreary drizzle of bland graduate chancers dominating the stage. The day before Brand's now famous interview with Jeremy Paxman was broadcast on Newsnight, I had seen Brand's stand-up show The Messiah Complex in Ipswich. The show is defiantly pro-immigrant, pro-communist, anti-homophobic, saturated with working-class intelligence and not afraid to show it, and queer in the way that pop culture used to be, i.e., nothing to do with the sour-faced identitarian piety foisted upon us by moralizers on the post-structuralist left. Malcolm X, Shea, politics as a psychedelic dismantling of existing reality. This was communism as something cool, sexy, proletarian, instead of a finger-wagging sermon. The next night, it was clear that Brand's appearance had produced a moment of splitting. For some of us, Brand's forensic takedown of Paxman was intensely moving, miraculous. I couldn't remember the last time a person from a working-class background had been given the space to so consummately destroy a class superior using intelligence and reason. This wasn't Johnny Rotten swearing at Bill Grundy, an act of antagonism which confirmed rather than challenged class stereotypes. Brand had outwitted Paxman, and the use of humor was what separated Brand from the dourness of so much leftism. Brand makes people feel good about themselves, whereas the moralizing left specializes in making people feel bad, and is not happy until their heads are bent in guilt and self-loathing. The moralizing left quickly ensured that the story was not about Brand's extraordinary breach of the bland conventions of the mainstream media debate, nor about his claim that revolution was going to happen. This last claim could only be heard by the cloth-eared, petty bourgeois, narcissistic left, as Brand saying that he wanted to lead the revolution, something that they responded to with typical resentment. I don't need a jumped-up celebrity to lead me. For the moralizers, the dominant story was about Brand's personal conduct, specifically his sexism. In the febrile McCarthyite atmosphere fermented by the moralizing left, remarks that could be construed as sexist mean that Brand is a sexist, which also meant that he is a misogynist. Cut and dried, finished, condemned. It is right that Brand, like any of us, should have to answer for his behavior and the language that he uses. But such questioning should take place in an atmosphere of comradeship and solidarity, and probably not in public in the first instance, although when Brand was questioned about sexism by Mehdi Hassan, he displayed exactly the kind of good-humored humility that was entirely lacking in the stony faces of those who had judged him. Quote, I don't think I'm a sexist, but I remember my grandmother, the loveliest person I've ever known, but she was a racist, but I don't think she knew. I don't know if I have some cultural hangover. I know I have a great love of proletariat linguistics, like Darling and Bird. So if women think I'm sexist, they're in a better position to judge than I am. So I'll work on that. End quote. Brand's intervention was not a bid for leadership. It was an inspiration, a call to arms. And I, for one, was inspired. Where a few months before, I would have stayed silent as the posh left moralizers subjected Brand to their kangaroo courts and character assassinations, with evidence usually gleaned from the right-wing press, always available to lend a hand. This time I was prepared to take them on. The response to Brand quickly became as significant as the Paxman exchange itself. As Laura Oldfield Ford pointed out, this was a clarifying moment, and one of the things that was clarified for me was the way in which, in recent years, so much of the self-styled left had suppressed the question of class. Class consciousness is fragile and fleeting. The petite bourgeoisie which dominates the academy and culture industry has all kinds of subtle deflections and preemptions which prevent the topic from even coming up. And then, if it does come up, they make one think it is a terrible impertinence, a breach of etiquette, to raise it. I've been speaking now at left-wing, anti-capitalist events for years, but I've rarely talked, or even been asked to talk, about class in public. But, once class had reappeared, it was impossible not to see it everywhere, in the response to the Brand affair. Brand was quickly judged and or questioned by at least 3 ex-private school people on the left. Others told us that Brand couldn't really be working class because he was a millionaire. It's alarming how many leftists seem to fundamentally agree with this drift behind Paxman's question. What gives this working class person the authority to speak? It's also alarming, actually distressing, that they seem to think that working class people should remain in poverty, obscurity, and impotence, lest they lose their authenticity. Someone passed me a post written about Brand on Facebook. I don't know the individual who wrote it, and I wouldn't want to name them. What's important is that the post was symptomatic of a set of snobbish and condescending attitudes that is apparently all right to exhibit, while still classifying oneself as left-wing. The whole tone was horrifyingly high-handed, as if they were a schoolteacher marking a child's work, or a psychiatrist assessing a patient. Brand apparently is, quote, clearly extremely unstable. one bad relationship or career knockback away from collapsing back into drug addiction, or worse, unquote. And although the person claims that they, quote, really like Brand, unquote, it perhaps never occurs to them that one of the reasons that Brand might be unstable is just this sort of patronizing, faux transcendent assessment from the left bourgeoisie. There's also a shocking but revealing aside where the individual casually refers to Brand's patchy education and the often wince-inducing vocab slips characteristic of the autodidact, which this individual generously says, "I have no problem with at all. How very good of them." This isn't some colonial bureaucrat writing about his attempts to teach some natives the English language in the 19th century, or a Victorian schoolmaster at some private institution describing a scholarship boy. It's a leftist, writing a few weeks ago. Where to go from here? It is first of all necessary to identify the features of the discourses and the desires which have led us to this grim and demoralizing pass, where class has disappeared, but moralism is everywhere, where solidarity is impossible, but guilt and fear are omnipresent. And not because we are terrorized by the right, but because we have allowed bourgeois modes of subjectivity to contaminate our movement. I think there are two libidinal discursive configurations which have brought the situation about. They call themselves left-wing, but, as the Brand episode has made clear, they are in many ways a sign that the left, defined as an agent in class struggle, has all but disappeared. Inside the vampire's castle. The first configuration is what I came to call the vampire's castle. The vampire's castle specializes in propagating guilt. It is driven by a priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, an academic pedant's desire to be the first seen to spot a mistake, and a hipster's desire to be one of the in-crowd. The danger in attacking the vampire's castle is that it can look as if, and it will do everything it can to reinforce this thought, that one is also attacking the struggles against racism, sexism, heterosexism. But far from being the only legitimate expression of such struggles, the vampire's castle is best understood as a bourgeois liberal perversion and appropriation of the energy of these movements. The vampire's castle was born the moment the struggle, not to be defined by identitarian categories, became the quest to have identities recognized by the bourgeois big other. The privilege I certainly enjoy as a white male consists in part my not being aware of my ethnicity and gender, and it is a sobering and revelatory experience to occasionally be made aware of these blind spots. But, rather than seeking a world in which everyone achieves freedom from identitarian classification, the vampire's castle seeks to corral people back into identity camps, where they are forever defined in the terms set by dominant power, crippled by self-consciousness, and isolated by a logic of solipsism, which insists that we cannot understand one another unless we belong to the same identity group. I've noticed a fascinating magical inversion projection disavowal mechanism, whereby the sheer mention of class is now automatically treated as if that means one is trying to downgrade the importance of race and gender. In fact, the exact opposite is the case, as the vampire's castle uses an ultimately liberal understanding of race and gender to obfuscate class. In all of the absurd and traumatic Twitter storms about privilege earlier this year, it was noticeable that the discussion of class privilege was entirely absent. The task, as ever, remains the articulation of class, gender, and race, but the founding move of the vampire's castle is the disarticulation of class from the other categories. The problem that the vampire's castle was set up to solve is this. How do you hold immense wealth and power while also appearing as a victim, marginal, oppositional? The solution was already there, in the Christian church. So, the VC has all the recourse to infernal strategies, dark pathologies, and psychological torture instruments which Christianity invented, and which Nietzsche described in the Genealogy of Morals. The priesthood of bad conscience, this nest of pious guilt-mongers, is exactly what Nietzsche predicted when he said that something worse than Christianity was already on the way. Now, here it is. The vampire's castle feeds on the energy and anxieties and vulnerabilities of young students, but most of all it lives by converting the suffering of particular groups, the more marginal, the better, into academic capital. The most lauded figures in the vampire's castle are those who have spotted a new market in suffering, those who can find a group more oppressed and subjugated than any previously exploited will find themselves promoted through the ranks very quickly. The first law of the vampire's castle is, individualize and privatize everything. While in theory, it claims to be in favor of a structural critique, in practice, it never focuses on anything except individual behavior. Some of these working class types are not terribly well brought up, and can be very rude at times. Remember, condemning individuals is always more important than paying attention to impersonal structures. The actual ruling class propagates ideologies of individualism, while tending to act as a class. Many of what we call conspiracies are the ruling class showing class solidarity. The VC, as dupe servants of the ruling class, does the opposite. It pays lip service to solidarity and collectivity, while always acting as if the individualist categories imposed by power really hold. Because they are petit bourgeois to the core, the members of the vampire's castle are intensely competitive, but this is repressed in the passive-aggressive manner typical of the bourgeoisie. What holds them together is not solidarity, but mutual fear. The fear that they will be the next one to be outed, exposed, condemned. The second law of Vampire's Castle is this: make thought and action appear very, very difficult. There must be no lightness and certainly no humor. Humor isn't serious by definition, right? Thought is hard work for people with posh voices and furrowed brows. Where there is confidence, introduce skepticism. Say, don't be hasty, we have to think more deeply about this. Remember, having convictions is oppressive, and it might lead to gulags. The third law of the Vampire's Castle is, propagate as much guilt as you can. The more guilt, the better. People must feel bad. It is a sign that they understand the gravity of things. It is okay to be class privileged if you feel guilty about privilege, and make others in a subordinate class position to you feel guilty too. You do some good works for the poor too, right? The fourth law of the Vampire's Castle is essentialize. While fluidity of identity, plurality, and multiplicity are always claimed on behalf of the VC members, partly to cover up their own invariably wealthy, privileged, or bourgeois assimilationist background, the enemy is always to be essentialized. Since the desires animating the VC are in large part priest desires to excommunicate and condemn, there has to be a strong distinction between good and evil, with the latter essentialized. Notice the tactics. X has made a remark, / has behaved in a particular way. These remarks / this behavior might be construed as transphobic / sexist, etc. So far, okay, but it's the next move which is the kicker. X then becomes defined as a transphobe / sexist, etc. Their whole identity becomes defined by one ill-judged remark or behavioral slip. Once the VC has mustered its witch hunt, the victim, often from a working-class background and not schooled in the passive-aggressive etiquette of the bourgeoisie, can be reliably goaded into losing their temper, further securing their position as pariah / latest to be consumed in feeding frenzy. The fifth law of the Vampire's Castle: think like a liberal, because you are one. The VC's work of constantly stoking up reactive outrage consists of endlessly pointing out the screamingly obvious. Capital behaves like capital. It's not very nice. Repressive state apparatuses are repressive. We must protest. Neo-anarchy in the UK. The second libidinal formation is neo-anarchism. By neo-anarchists, I do not mean anarchists or syndicalists involved in actual workplace organization, such as the Solidarity Federation. I mean rather those who identify as anarchists but whose involvement in politics extends little beyond student protests and occupations and commenting on Twitter. They are also overwhelmingly young, in their 20s or at most their early 30s, and what informs the neo-anarchist position is a narrow historical horizon. Neo-anarchists have experienced nothing but capitalist realism. By the time the neo-anarchist has come to political consciousness, and many of them have come to political consciousness remarkably recently, given the level of bullish swagger they sometimes display, the Labour Party had become a Blairite shell, implementing neoliberalism with small doses of social justice on the side. But the problem with neo-anarchism is that it unthinkingly reflects the historical moment, rather than offering any escape from it. It forgets, or perhaps genuinely is unaware of, the Labour Party's role in nationalizing major industries and utilities, or founding the National Health Service. Neo-anarchists will assert that parliamentary politics never changed anything, or that the Labour Party was always useless, while attending protests about the NHS, or retweeting complaints about the dismantling of what remains of the welfare state. There is a strange implicit rule here. It's okay to protest against what Parliament has done, but it's not alright to enter into Parliament or the mass media to attempt to engineer change from there. Mass media is to be disdained, but BBC Question Time is to be watched and moaned about on Twitter. Puritanism fades into fatalism. Better not to be in any way tainted by the corruption of the mainstream. Better to uselessly resist than to risk getting your hands dirty. It is not surprising, then, that so many neo-anarchists come across as depressed. This depression is no doubt reinforced by the anxieties of postgraduate life, since, like the vampire's castle, neo-anarchism has its natural home in universities, and is usually propagated by those studying for postgraduate qualifications, or those who have recently graduated from such study. What is to be done? Why have these two configurations come to the fore? The first reason is that they have been allowed to prosper by capital because they serve its interests. Capital subdued the organized working class by decomposing class consciousness, viciously subjugating trade unions, while seducing hardworking families into identifying with their own narrowly defined interests instead of the interests of the wider class. But why would capital be concerned about a left that replaces class politics with a moralizing individualism, and that, far from building solidarity, spreads fear and insecurity? The second reason is what Jody Dean has called communicative capitalism. It might be possible to ignore the vampire's castle and the neo-anarchists if it weren't for capitalist cyberspace. The VC's pious moralizing has been a feature of a certain left for many years, but if one wasn't a member of this particular church, its sermons could be avoided. Social media means that this is no longer the case. There is little protection from the psychic pathologies propagated by these discourses. So what can we do now? First of all, it is imperative to reject identitarianism and to recognize that there are no identities, only desires, interests, and identifications. Part of the importance of the British Cultural Studies Project, as revealed so powerfully and so movingly in John Akenfraw's installation The Unfinished Conversation, currently in Tate Britain, and his film The Stuart Hall Project, was to have resisted identitarian essentialism. Instead of freezing people into chains of already existing equivalences, the point was to treat any articulation as provisionally plastic. New articulations can always be created. No one is essentially anything. Sadly, the right act on this insight more effectively than the left does. The bourgeois identitarian left knows how to propagate guilt and conduct a witch hunt, but it does not know how to make converts. But that, after all, is not the point. The aim is not to popularize a leftist position, or to win people over to it, but to remain in a position of elite superiority. But now with class superiority, redoubled by a moral superiority too. How dare you talk? It's we who speak for those who suffer. But the rejection of identitarianism can only be achieved by the reassertion of a class. A left that does not have class at its core can only be a liberal pressure group. Class consciousness is always double. It involves the simultaneous knowledge of the way in which class frames and shapes all experience, and a knowledge of the particular position that we occupy in the class structure. It must be remembered that the aim of our struggle is not recognition by the bourgeoisie, nor even the destruction of the bourgeoisie itself. It is the class structure, a structure that wounds everyone, even those who materially profit from it, that must be destroyed. The interests of the working class are the interests of all. The interests of the bourgeoisie are the interests of capital, which are the interests of no one. Our struggle must be towards the construction of a new and surprising world, not the preservation of identities shaped and distorted by capital. If this seems like a forbidding and daunting task, it is. But we can start to engage in many prefigurative activities right now. Actually, such activities would go beyond prefiguration. They could start a virtuous cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy in which bourgeois modes of subjectivity are dismantled, and new universality starts to build itself. We need to learn, or relearn, how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. This doesn't mean, of course, that we must always agree. On the contrary, we must create conditions where disagreement can take place without the fear of exclusion and excommunication. We need to think very strategically about how to use social media, always remembering that, despite the egalitarianism claimed for social media by capital's libidinal engineers, that this is currently an enemy territory, dedicated to the reproduction of capital. But this doesn't mean we can't occupy the terrain and start to use it for the purposes of producing class consciousness. We must break out of the debate set up by communicative capitalism, in which capital is endlessly cajoling us to participate, and remember that we are involved in a class struggle. The goal is not to be an activist, but to aid the working class to activate and to transform itself. Outside the vampire's castle, anything is possible. Okay, so that was the essay. There's actually, I was keeping up with the conversation in chat, quite an interesting conversation about how this still relates to the left in the UK. And I think somebody else also pointed out that it applies to the left in America as well. And I think, as a Canadian, it applies to the left in Canada too. It's quite a universal leftist approach on perhaps in the West. So let's start just by looking at these two libidinal discursive figurations. This is the quote. I think there are two libidinal discursive configurations which have brought this situation about. They call themselves left-wing, but as the Brand episode has made clear, they are in many ways a sign that the left has, defined as an agent of class struggle, has all but disappeared. The first configuration is what I call the vampire's castle. The second is neo-anarchism. So obviously, the vampire's castle, this is the stuff everybody tends to talk about. So we'll kind of brush through the vampire castle stuff because I want to try to get into some more weird, more niche kind of takes on this paper. So he presents three desires which kind of drive the vampire's castle. There's the priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn. There's the academic pedant's desire to be the first person to spot a mistake. And there is also the hipster's desire to be part of the in-crowd. Since everyone here has an internet connection, I think we're all pretty well aware of this tendency. I think we can all draw up plenty of examples of these desires, but keep them in mind because they're going to come up a little bit later on. Okay, so the 5 laws of the vampire's castle. The first one is individualize and privatize everything. So under these kind of individualist modes of subjectivity, the moral critique, which is often there, it rarely actually develops into structural critique. So just a really simple example of this for environmentalism. We quite often hear the critique that pollution is bad, therefore you should drive less, right? You should ride your bike, you should ride share, carpool, take public transport, that sort of thing. Very rarely is it framed, the critique, as we should work to abolish the production of pollution-creating vehicles, or we should work to create a system which can't sustain, the production of things which are going to destroy the planet. But that's never the critique, right? The critique is always aimed at the consumer, on the individual. What can you do? What have you done to make the world a better place? The second law of the vampire's castle is to make thought and action appear very difficult. So I think this is, I don't actually like this formulation all that much, simply because, I think it's true. The vampire's castle does make action and thought appear very, very difficult, but in a lot of cases, especially with politics, thought and action is very, very difficult, right? What would be a good way to frame this instead? Something, a better way to look at it, I think, would be to look at it as, it's the disavowal of conviction which is the problem. It's to say, as soon as you have a conviction, that's going to lead to gulags, right? There are plenty of thoughts and actions which are very, very difficult, and that's totally fine. But the problem is when you being, convicted towards those actions or those thoughts, when you're actually committed to them, suddenly that presents an issue. The third law of the vampire's castle is to propagate as much guilt as you can. This works in two ways, as he pointed out. Not only do you propagate guilt outwards in the form of the moralizing priest desire, telling people that they're wrong, it also breeds guilt in the individual as well. Guilt is sort of like this proof that you care enough in a strange way. And in the same way that I think plays into the hipster's desire to fit in, that you can't really be a part of the in-group unless you're guilty, because that guilt sort of symbolizes that you're conscious of what's happening. The fourth law is essentialize. I think this is probably the most important law of what the vampire castle does, and probably the one we're going to be looking at the most. It's this general tendency towards essentializing things in general. It's largely motivated, I think, by the priest's desire to excommunicate and denounce evil. And it comes into this transitive movement that we were looking at with Brand, where X says Y could be construed as Z, and therefore X is Z. And we'll get into that later on. The fifth law of the Vampire's Castle is think like a liberal because you are one. I don't think that needs very much explanation. He's pretty much just dunking on faux Marxists here. Okay, so then he gives this second libidinal discursive formation called neo-anarchism. Neo-anarchism works to diffuse class struggle by being an activist rather than working to activate the working class. The quote that he gives here: those who identify as anarchists but whose involvement in politics extends little beyond student protests and occupations and commenting on Twitter. There is a strange implicit rule here. It's okay to protest against what Parliament has done, but it's not all right to enter into Parliament or the mass media to attempt to engineer change from here. I think this is it's very, very like right on the money. He's very accurate here. Especially this weird this insistence that you can't really engage with politics without becoming corrupt, right? And therefore to sort of wash your hands of the whole deal is there's a bit of purity in it, or puritanism. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. Just being able to wash your hands of something doesn't mean you're actually above it. I mean, Marx makes a big deal out of this. Resisting capital, right? To be able to say, I'm going to step away from capitalism and step away from exploitation and live my own life. That's only a decision the bourgeois can make. You know, the proletariat can't make the decision to leave capital, short of starving to death, you know? Like, they rely on it. So the idea of being able to excuse me, the idea of being able to wash your hands and step away, it's not a proletarian position. It's not a Marxist position, right? Like, you have to get your hands dirty. You have to dig through the shit of capital, to use a term from last lecture. And his analysis of Twitter storms, I think, are pretty spot on. This was written in 2013, so for at least 7 years, this has been a pretty dominant sort of thing on Twitter. These Twitter storms and people being called out. It's only gotten much worse since 2013, that's for sure. And somebody else was noting in the chat earlier, and I think this is quite important, is this sort of neo-anarchist position is a big reason for why a lot of people tended to disassociate themselves with the left. It became a very... I mean, me as a leftist, I mean, I pissed off a lot of people just having opinions during, like, the 2016 election. Not even, like, right-wing opinions or anything like that, but just simply opinions which didn't quite fit into the whole thing. And largely it came down to that being above it, right? Of saying, well, I'm not trying to actually step into a idealist critique or whatever of what I think the best thing is. I'm just kind of looking at politics on the ground. And even that in itself is enough to kind of discount you as being, yeah, one of the untouchables or something like that. So if we're going to bring this into an example that people are maybe a little more familiar about, ContraPoints recently has gone through a number of her own Twitter storms, right? So the Brand controversy was he's a comedian decried as a sexist, and ContraPoints, she's a trans woman YouTuber who was decried as non-binary phobic or something along those lines. Just to give like a really quick kind of paraphrase of what she was talking about, at least in this case here. She was expressing the feeling that she could walk into a bar in a red state in the US and be missed and mammed all night long without anybody, you know, giving her any hassle. But somehow when she enters into an ultra woke safe space, everyone is encouraging her to give her pronouns. Now, as a trans woman, her being recognized as a woman is obviously important to her. It shouldn't even need to be said, right? But somehow, in this interplay between the ultra-woke spaces and her having to give her pronouns, she feels like it's actually robbing her of some of that recognition. In a weird way, the practices of the safe space lessen the amount of recognition that she feels as a trans woman. Now, Does this comment fully invalidate the idea of safe spaces? No. Does it invalidate the practice of even asking about pronouns? Of course not. She never even argued against these things. Like, she never said that we shouldn't have safe spaces, or that no one should, be encouraged to give their pronouns. She was just giving her own experience, right? Her own take on the way she feels in some of these spaces. But the problem is, this comment could be construed as offensive to, say, non-binary people who aren't as readily offered recognition to their preferred pronoun. And since it could be construed as such, the next move. This understandable, sympathetic position is taken as proof that ContraPoints is problematic, transphobic, non-binary phobic, whatever they, whatever people want to call her. Person makes a statement, right? The statement could represent X, therefore this person is X. So Contra makes a statement regarding her personal experiences. The statement could be considered as being against the idea of respecting people's pronouns. Therefore, Contra is against the idea of respecting people's pronouns. It doesn't actually really take into account the fuller aspect of her being a trans woman, expressing her experience as a trans woman in the world, right? It just instantly drops to finding that one quote that could be taken out of context and yanking it out of context as quickly as possible. So hopefully that's a little more of a relevant example than the brand controversy, which is a little bit old and took place in the UK. So what really interested me reading all this stuff, again, was this transitive property dynamic that's happening. So transitive properties in formal logic, they're real. Like, you can't do this. If X is Y and all Y's are Z, then X is Z. It's pretty standard logical form. So logically it's sound, right? I mean, we can look at an example like, this fruit is an apple, all apples are red, therefore this fruit is red. As long as the first two premises are correct, the third premise is correct as well. It's a sound logical argument. But the neo-anarchists, they do the similar type of thing, but they do it in reverse. So if for instance they are X is construed as being radical or activists, an activist or something like that. Therefore, neo-anarchists are radicals or activists or whatever. They don't actually have to go out and do anything, right? As long as they are saying the right words on Twitter, as long as they're signaling to the right virtues, they sort of automatically get that pass, because even the good is sort of essentialized in that way. So Hegel actually critiqued this this approach to logic, at least in a concrete sense, in a broad sense, as what he called abstract thinking. So let me just read this quote. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth it. A murderer is led to the place of execution. For the common populace, he is nothing more than a murderer. Ladies perhaps remark that he is strong, handsome, interesting, etc. The populace find this remark terrible. What? A murderer handsome? How could one so wickedly call a murderer handsome? No doubt you yourself are something much better. This is the corruption of morals that is prevalent in the upper classes, a priest may add, knowing the bottom of things and human hearts. One who knows men traces the development of the criminal's mind. He finds in his history the education, a bad family relationship between his father and mother, some tremendous harshness after this human being had done in some minor wrong, so he had become embittered against the social order. A first reaction to this that in effect expelled him and henceforth did not make it possible for him to preserve himself except through crime. There may be people who will say when they hear such a thing, he wants to excuse this murderer. After all, I remember how in my youth I heard a mere lament of the writers of books were going too far, and sought to extirpate Christianity and the righteousness altogether. Someone had written a defense of suicide. Terrible, really too terrible. Further questions revealed that the sufferings of Werther were meant. This is too abstract thinking. To see nothing in the murderer except the abstract fact that he is a murderer, and to annul all other human essence in him with this simple quality. So can a murderer be handsome? Yes, sure. Can a murderer have a background which might explain the crime that he committed? Yeah, absolutely. But just because we acknowledge these things doesn't mean that we somehow need to discount them from the crime, right? So Hegel says that abstract thinking enters when you reduce sort of the concrete essence of something, the human essence of a human, into a simple quality. A murderer is a murderer, and there's no two ways around it. But a murderer is never just a murderer, right? Like we saw, identities don't really exist. There are only identifications. So by seeing a murderer in this way, we're really only looking at one simple quality of that person. What Hegel might point out is that, let's take the apple example, right? Even if we take for granted that all apples are red, and that this fruit in my hand is in fact a red apple, it began as an immature apple, which is green, right? And that apple, the green immature apple, in fact started out as a bud, which cannot even be called an apple to begin with. So while the transitive property might be true in abstraction, in a simple sense, it ignores the concrete whole of the essence, all the essential moments which actually make something up. So let's take the murderer example again. Say that the only reason he killed that one man was, say, to save 10 more, the classic example we give in ethics. Say, in pleading his concrete case, that people even come to realize that there really is no person to lock this person up. There's no reason, because, in fact, he was brave to do what he did. It was actually a good thing at the end of the day. This doesn't change the fact that he killed somebody. Like, he can still be a murderer. It's only to take out that simple element and only look at that rather than to look at the whole. So I guess the biggest thing to take away from this is that on the left, we don't need to be caught between this dilemma of like hypermoralism and chaos. We can accept that someone expressed sentiments which might be taken as offensive, but in their concrete existence, taken as a whole, they are in fact expressions of an honest and well-meaning ally, right? We don't need to be the academic pedant salivating over the next nit we find to pick, lest we let sexism and racism run rampant. Like, ContraPoints isn't a risk to the left in any sense. It's the moralizing Inquisition, which, forced her to, at one point, delete her Twitter account. That is the risk to the left. That is the true danger in the vampire's castle to the left. Not ContraPoints expressing her opinions as a trans woman. Not Brand using the word bird. Okay, so this last section here, I don't know, I kind of threw all this together at the end. It's getting a little bit off course, but we're going all over the place. So we're gonna do it anyway. So it's a little bit of a minor point. What do the words proletarian and bourgeois actually mean? A lot of people today actually get this wrong. They think of this as something like a distinction between like the poor class and the wealthy class. But bourgeoisie was not the wealthy class, and proletariat wasn't the poor class. The bourgeoisie was the class which had ownership over the means of production, and the proletariat was the class which subsisted by selling their labor. This means that Marx didn't actually make a distinction between rich and poor in that simple, basic way. The difference between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie lies in ownership. So if you own a factory, right, you're bourgeoisie. If you write your own jokes and perform them on stage for money, that's still labor. You're still a proletariat. The distinction is whether you survive by selling your labor or by making money off the means of production which you own. So, for instance, say you're a professional painter, right, and you sell your paintings, you become really famous. You sell your paintings for millions upon millions of dollars. You're still a proletariat. There's nothing in painting a painting and selling it for $1 million that somehow means that you own the means of production of society, right? Other than, I guess, your paintbrushes and paint that you might have bought. But if you are a painter and you buy an art factory and you start hiring people to make art for you, which you then sell for a profit, you become bourgeoisie. Like, it's not a separation of wealth. It's a separation of what you own and how you make money off of it. Obviously, this is a lot more blurry today. Most people, even in the middle class, they have ownership over some abstract form of the means of productions. Things like pensions are a big sign of this, right? A lot of people, they don't want the stock market to go down, not because they own all the stocks, but simply because when they retire, their entire pension is based off of something, some abstract form of ownership over these. But still, the idea that you must be poor, the idea that you must be ineffectual in order to be a proletariat is not what Marx meant at all. Authenticity doesn't come from alienation, okay? And alienation isn't a proof that you are authentic. And it's an easy mistake to kind of fall into that if you think it is. Okay. So, here's a quote. The aim is not to popularize the leftist position or to win people over to it, but to remain in a position of elite superiority. But now with class superiority redoubled by a moral superiority. How dare you talk? It is we who speak for those who suffer. So, to touch on this, I'm actually going to play us a quick clip from Zizek. It's just a few minutes long, but I think he really hits the nail on the head of why liberals tend to be drawn towards this idea of identity politics.
It's a well-known, I'm sorry if you know it, I used it.
Okay, so, sorry, gotta switch some stuff around here. Okay, and I'm gonna mute myself so you guys don't have to hear me.
It's a well-known, I'm sorry if you know it, I used it 2-3 times in my books. It was also used already by many philosophers, even Derrida. I know Derrida used it. A joke about Jews gathered in a synagogue on Shabbat to publicly declare their failures or whatever, and first a mighty rabbi says, "Forgive me, O God, I am nothing, not worthy of your attention." After him, a rich Jewish merchant says, "Forgive me, O God, I am a worthless nothing." Then a poor ordinary Jew steps forward and says, "Forgive me, God, I am also nothing." At that point, it doesn't matter who, the rich merchant steps, a rich rabbi, and says, "But who this guy think that he is? He thinks how dares he also to claim that he is a nothing? We are the nothing." That's the white liberal lie today. Precisely when white liberals humiliate themselves, and I notice this again and again, like, we are worthless, we don't have the right, that's subtle racism expressed in this form. If you are an exotic nation, like if Native Americans dance their tribal dances and so on, that's perfect. They are asserting their particular identity. If I say, let's assert German identity, oh, you are a Nazi, you are a fascist. Okay, I know in what sense this is true. But nonetheless, there is something false in it. Why? Because denying you the right to your particular identity, in this false sense, humiliating yourself, means that in a much more subtle way, you reserve for yourself the universal position. And that's why I claim white liberals love identity politics. It means minorities can have their particular identities, but we renounce our identity, but we keep this role of guardians of universality. I wonder if this is also your experience. It's my regular experience that these same self-humiliating white liberals have no problem of correcting minorities if they perceive their position as wrong. Like, sorry guys, you fell into colonialist trap here, this is not the right way to talk about it, and so on and so on. So that's why my advice is the one already elaborated. I've written about this a lot. I will not repeat myself. It's the one of Malcolm X. He was a true universalist. I'm sorry if I repeat myself here. Malcolm X, it was a Hegelian stroke of a genius. He emphasized it. X doesn't mean, oh, white people stole from us our roots. Yes, but his point is not, so let's regain our roots and look for some original tribal identity in Africa. No, he saw this being deprived of roots, X, like we don't have our particular identity, as a unique chance for the black people to propose a new universality which will be much more authentic and radical than white people's universality, which is still a false universality. Always remember this. The true struggle is the struggle for universality. And liberals like to transform, mystify this struggle into the struggle of particular identities, where then they can play their game, of your particular identity, my particular identity, let them coexist, and so on and so on.
So I think one of the things that he really draws on here that Fisher points at too is it's that idea of the recognition of identity by the big other. Fisher's quote is, "The Vampire's Castle is best understood as a bourgeois liberal perversion and appropriation of the energy of leftist movements. The Vampire's Castle was born when the struggle to not be defined by identitarian categories became the quest to have identities recognized by the bourgeois big other." So, in a way, this recognition of identities it's solidifying identitarianism. You're not actually resisting it. You're not actually saying that the goal is to be to move beyond these sorts of distinctions between race and sex or whatever, but simply that you want to see these expressions of race and sex mirrored or reflected in the sort of ruling class. So it's not actually about overthrowing capitalism, it's about diversifying capitalism. So long as we have, enough minorities in places of power, suddenly the structure is no longer exploitative. All it took was just getting enough white people out of the power, right? It becomes a very strangely racist critique simply because they want to avoid looking at race by throwing out their own culture. And I think it is that approach for a universal subject. You want to aim for the recognition of identities by the big other, diversification of class rather than abolishment. But in a way, this also preserves other cultures too, because you're essentializing them in that way. For the Malcolm X position, the typical sort of liberal approach would be that you need to look back to your roots, that you need to go and find out what it truly means to be African American or something like that, right? But the other option here is to say, no, we're going to strive for universalism. We're not going to be put into some box which you have said that is our culture. And quite often it's a very white liberal take on what other people's cultures are and what they consider natural, right? And it's just another way of boxing in those minorities and then you get that beautiful universalist position of saying no, you're tricked by the white man, when meanwhile it's the white person even saying that, but because they've renounced their whiteness, suddenly they can step outside of race and all that stuff and become the universal position to say who's actually right and who's actually wrong. So and that renouncement of your own culture, it's all performative, right? I mean, it's just as performative as somebody going and embracing their culture from hundreds of years ago or whatever as some sort of sign or demonstration of authenticity. It's all performative because, again, we've already agreed there is no identity. There is no ultimate authentic thing to go back to, not in your alienation and not in your identity. All there are those identifications and roles and performances and all those things we take place in. So that is why the liberal position coming out of the Vampire's Castle, I think, is dangerous in that sort of sense. And it's a sense that people don't often read into this paper. At least I didn't read it into this paper before going back over it again. This the universalist position of not flagellation, but self-abolition but it's a performative abolition, right, of your own identity in order to maintain a moral universalist position, which then ironically is only used to further enforce other people's essential identities. Or just leftists fighting with each other. So, that was my take, I guess. It was a little bit more all over the place than last time. Hopefully there was some interesting stuff in there. I'm going to go through. I'm going to see if there was any questions or anything. If you guys do have any questions you want to ask, feel free to throw them in the chat. Unfortunately, it's hard to keep an eye on chat while I am doing these lectures, so I'm kind of just scrolling up and going through it from the top. Please remove the dancing dude. It's very annoying. Can't focus on what you say because of it. Oh, sorry. It's too late now. How could you be... Look at him. He's adorable. Look at him dance. Okay, let's try to find a question here. Cornelio James says, Fisher's VC, Vampire's Castle, is basically an elaboration of some of the more viable criticisms in NRX. See, I would agree to a certain degree. I think that the Cathedral and the Vampire's Castle do line up in a pretty like, it's pretty straightforward how they line up. But at the same time, I think this critique is actually, it's much more grounded in like what's actually happening on Twitter and stuff like that. There's a certain element of the Cathedral that gets a bit transcendent, almost. Like, and maybe this is not so much from Moldbug, but neo-reactionaries in general. But there's this idea that like somehow the left has like a total control over media and all those sorts of things, and like controlling the narrative. And I think that the last few years have basically proven that wrong. Like, how can you both accept that, yes, like the left controls the media and it controls like the narrative that people believe, and Trump is about to lose the second, or win a second election? Like, surely those two things can't quite line up. Either the Cathedral isn't as all powerful as it's made out to be in the NRX critique, or it's falling apart and Trump has bested it, right? And has actually proven that fake news is fake news. But with this critique, I think it's a little more helpful because it actually looks at like the direct ideologies on the left which are contributing to this. It's not just leftism in general. It's not just academia in general. It's like the neo-anarchist position, right? It's very specific parts of that. BR says, doesn't seem like anything has changed at all. Yeah, pretty much. I think all this stuff holds up really well. And I a lot of my leftist friends don't like me for saying this, but I think this is one of the reasons why Trump very much is going to win this next election, or at least he has a very good chance of it. Greg Harmston says the purity testing, etc., has all got stronger since he wrote this. Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Like, it's weird to think this is in 2013 too, because from my memory, and I could be wrong about this, I think a lot of the debates about like the harmfulness over cancel culture, like, it didn't really come about until after 2016. Maybe that's just me misremembering. Let's see. Erito said this did actually eliminate the pronoun ambiguity should be optional, but the safe spaces would become more optional in the safe spaces. Yeah, like, I don't think it's like there's things you can draw from it. It's not saying one thing or another. It's just somebody's experience, like totally honest experience, which you can then treat however you want. Like, we can use it as an example, like, for a way to improve safe spaces, or we could say, no, you're wrong, right? But like, to simply say you're wrong without actually putting in the work, it's that like, you said something that could be wrong, therefore it must be wrong, rather than, hey, maybe you're actually pointing out an error on our side. So yeah, I would agree. I know, I think you explained that pretty well. I think I get where you're coming from. Noah Watson says, I think what generally constitutes the left is working class people, ethnic minorities, and bourgeois progressives, and these groups seem to be diverging. Yeah, there's a critique Zizek actually gives too of leftists, that there's a push right now to move towards redefining proletariat as something like minority, or refugee is a big one, to think that like the refugee is going to be the next proletariat subject. And in a way, it's, again, like this, it's faux Marxist, because what you're basically doing is just outsourcing the revolutionary subject, which, I mean, I couldn't imagine a less Marxist position than that. Erato says, I think art millionaires might be petite bourgeoisie. Yeah, so it's a confusing point, because Marx actually wasn't as cut and dry as this. And once he starts going into things like lumpenproletariat and petite bourgeoisie, it gets much more confusing to draw those sorts of distinctions. But I think there is a general sort of approach, even from leftists, to think that somehow to be working class means you must be poor, and that the moment you're not poor, you somehow are part of the bourgeoisie. And that was never Marx's position. Noah Watson says, or maybe it's just bourgeois progressives trying to appeal to minorities to a greater degree than the working class, instead of all these groups diverging. Oh, this is a follow-up from his last comment. Maybe it's just... I think part of it, yeah, there is definitely an appeal to minorities, but it's always that putting people in those identity camps where they can't actually have a discursive conversation or dialectics between the two groups. Like, if you aren't a woman, you don't know a woman's experience, and therefore, you can't talk about women's issues. Is it right to a certain degree? Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I don't think that it can be taken in that simple element to be then taken as no one who's a woman can have any knowledge of women's issues, right? It's again, we just have to resist that essentializing. We have to try to refrain and keep it concrete. Can you explain the university thing? That was Watcher. Which university thing? Something I said or something Fisher said? Sorry, these are kind of old comments, so I'm maybe a little off. So it's a realization of ethnic... This is Noah Watson. So is it just a realization of ethnic interest but siding with the historically oppressed? Just a realization of ethnic interest. I think part of it involves the realization of ethnic interest, but not ethnic interests as they are defined by white liberal essentialism. Ethnic interests as they are defined by ethnicities themselves, right? Like, if Malcolm X wants to build a totally universal, new subjectivity based on this sort of being what's the word I'm looking for? Being alienated from his history, from his identity, then yeah, like, it may not even be an ethnic interest necessarily that comes out of that, but it comes from listening to that person and their take on it, rather than just subscribing them to that ethnic sort of pre-configured, transcendent position, essentialized position. Iceland Bob says, this is basically Scandinavian egalitarianism, where everyone is equal, but everyone is prescribed into a singular cultural spread. I don't know anything about Scandinavian politics. I couldn't really tell you. It's weird, like, Scandinavia is one of those weird ones where some people think it's like it's a liberal, like, or left-wing paradise, and other people think it's like slowly eroding into something else. I don't know enough about it, so I don't want to comment. Greg Harmson says, in the UK, I think the neo-lib/id poll progressives focus on minorities means they have in their paradigm to automatically side against white people who make up the majority of the working class. And maybe that's a UK thing. I don't think it's a necessary thing. No, Watson. I don't understand why there aren't any coherent identities. Because all we have is... we don't actually have identities, we have identifications. Well, let me see if I can find the quote here. Give me just a moment. Identifications. It is imperative to reject identitarianism and to recognize that there are no identities, only desires, interests, and identifications. So what this would be, I guess a way to think about it would be, you are framing it as sorry, moving stuff around on my screen. You're framing it as it's something transcendent, I think, is the best way to think about it. Like with materialism, there's only these identifications, these relations, everything like that. It's when you step back into the more transcendent idealist sort of take on things that you start seeing those identifications as being something fixed. Like the Catholic Church today is seen as relatively benign. I mean, I'm going to ignore their sexual scandals, whatever. But I mean, in the Spanish Revolution or Spanish Inquisition, it was a totally different Catholic Church, right? You can't essentialize the Catholic Church then as being, oh, well, it's about burning people at the stake, right? But there was a particular identification going on there with Catholicism that certainly led to people being burned at the stake. So I think it's the difference between identities and identification, right? Identities means like this is what something is. Identification means like this is what something is being. And we need to resist that sort of transcendent, essentialized. Once something is this way, it's always going to be that way, right? Rather than it is simply being this way. Okay. It's hard too, because I don't know if I'm even making sense on some of these answers, because I can't really read your answers. I'm like halfway up the chat. Hopefully this stuff makes sense. Feel free to ask clarifying questions if I'm not making any sense. Cornelio James says Mulbug definitely overestimates the power of the cathedral. Yeah, I think that's a real critique you can make of NRX. And I'm not the biggest NRX proponent. Like I haven't done the most reading on that stuff. But I think that the idea of the cathedral made a lot of sense up until Trump won the election. And then suddenly it's like, well, the same with actually, you know what's another one that it kind of put into question is this idea of out of Fukuyama, like the end of history, and the idea of Chomsky's manufacturing consent. Like all these sorts of things have completely broken down. Like there is no manufactured consent anymore. There is no end of history. There is none of this when suddenly Trump comes out of nowhere and becomes president of the United States. Like and all your top-down sort of approaches of how the media is in control of everything just suddenly go out the window. Diogenes the Cynic says, what is the counter to this position of insidious neo-anarchism? I don't think there is like an ideological position to jump to, but I think the easiest approach would be to start looking at things concretely, and stop trying to simply work off of identities. Like it's interesting that he talks about this obsession with identities and people on Twitter and neo-anarchists. There's this weird thing I notice on Twitter where people will put like 12 different like tags under their bio, you know, and like some of them won't even like match up with one another. They're like a mutualist, anarcho-syndicalist, NRX, eco-fascist, or just something completely like, you're like, I don't think any of these things can actually go together, but I feel like you just want to it's that as long as you say you're X and X can be construed as Y, then you're Z, right? You don't actually need to do any of those things so long as it can be construed that you are those things. Yeah, I think that's an issue. So I don't think there is like a good position to beat it, to counter it. I think all it takes is just thinking a little bit deeper, a little bit harder. Watcher asked, do you know Theory Plebe? I like his work because it has some rational points about... yeah, I have seen a little bit of his work. I'm not all that familiar, though. Like, I would like to watch more. Watcher says, leftist meetings are always just refining how some other group or person is to be argued against. Leftist meetings are always just... Yeah, I think... Like, if you mean like how they operate today, I think a lot of that just comes down to this like very complex... Like, it's weird how many terms too pop up on the left that had never existed before this point, and then suddenly everyone starts using them on Twitter and they have this exact definition. And you go like, what, was there a paper on that? Like, there must have been a paper or like a group somewhere that decided it, or yeah, but somehow we are managing to refine these groups and persons in very very elaborate ways, that's for sure. Technophile, why did Nick Lance stand Moldbug so hard? He was very upset with the way the world went, and he got butthurt. That's my take on it. He really likes the neo-reactionary position, I guess, because he doesn't think that woke capital is cool and Terminator enough for him. BR says, I get the critique of moralist posturing, but is there a conversation to be had about concrete approach to race, gender, etc. that takes account alienation into these areas and doesn't subsume it into class conflict? It feels like a line to walk. Yeah. So I think the Marxist position is to strictly say, like, it is a matter of class and economics and material conditions. Like, there's a very big push for some people on the Marxist side of things to abandon class struggle because, or at least like put it to the side and try to equal race and culture up with it, that sort of stuff, race and sex and culture. But one of the issues is like saying that like we need to have a concrete analysis of race, or like we need to have a concrete analysis of culture or sex, you know, that's not something that like we didn't have before, right? And Marx like just was ignorant to, and had Marx been living now, he would realize that, oh, we can make concrete analyses of race and culture. He looked at the analysis of race and culture at his time, right, and went like, this isn't working. There is something wrong with this approach to try to look at things concretely, strictly by reference to things like race, things like culture, things like religion. And instead, we need to look at things like economics, material conditions, because that's where we get our ideas behind race and culture and sex. Like, they're always downstream of economics. So I think for the Marxist position, I don't think it's necessarily a useful thing to do. Because basically what you're just saying is like, let's just do what was happening before Marx. It's not like it's like a pre-Marxist position even. But at the same time, like, I don't think that Marx, like, strict adherence to everything Marx says is necessarily like the only way forward, right? So there very well might be more concrete approaches to race and gender that we just haven't quite dug out yet. But from a Marxist perspective, yeah, I think that the analysis of class and material conditions and historical development and ownership of those conditions, those things are a little bit more enlightening if you're looking for a concrete approach. Oh, can you explain the universality thing? Sorry, Watcher. Yeah. So Watcher asks if I can explain the universality thing. When you are in the realm of identities, right? It's said that like you can only understand people's their identity if you're part of that group, right? So like as a man, I don't have the experience of a woman to talk about women's issues, right? You see this all the time, you know, when white people start talking about minorities. Oh, well, you need to bring a minority in here because you as a white person, you don't speak for them or whatever. And what the universality position is saying, like, Marxism is pro-universality. It's saying, yes, everybody should be in a position where through things like appealing to the material conditions, we can all understand what's happening, everyone's relations and stuff like that. But at the same time, what they want to do is keep everybody else essentialized, but step themselves into the position of universality by abandoning their race, right? So by saying like, oh yeah, white people are bad, they are no longer part of that group of white people which can't talk about minorities. As soon as they say white people are bad, suddenly they can talk about minorities all they want. And I think that's the faux universalist liberal position that Zizek was pointing at. Sorry, guys. Another name. What is the next lecture about? It's going to be about ontology. It's going to be another Fisher lecture. I don't know. Are you guys enjoying the Fisher lectures? I had 3 planned. I had these 2, and then the next one on ontology. I think those are kind of 3. I like he kind of touch on his accelerationism, his takes on politics, and his takes on ontology. I think that's a kind of broad Fisher rundown. But if you guys have any other things you want to see read or anything like that, let me know for sure. Ice and Bob, I can give you some papers on Scandi socio-political egalitarianism. Sure, yeah. I don't know if I have a ton of time to get around to read them, but I would certainly like to read them at some point. Cornelio James says, am I saying that right? Is it like Yamies or something? I might be, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. What do you think of the connection between this essay and transcendental miserabilism as fleshed out by Land? Yeah, geez, there's probably a lot to say there. A lot of people often look at transcendental miserabilism as like kind of a crypto takedown of Fisher. I don't know. Maybe I'll do a video on it because I feel like I'd need to read it again and really flesh that out before I say anything too solid about it. Noah Watson. Don't different groups have different views of the good that they want to strive towards, like religions? Aren't these coherent identities? I think I get the point about specific movements being overdefined incoherently into identities, but why can't logic be applied to every possible identity? Applying this logic to every possible identity, I'm not 100% sure what you're getting at there. Like, applying the logic of... Like, I guess which logic, I guess I'm a little bit unsure of. I think that like different groups, yeah, they do have different views of the good, for sure, like religions. But as like Marx was pointing out, like that doesn't necessarily mean that like a Christian can never understand a Muslim, or a man can never understand a woman, because they just have different views of the good. It's even if they have different ideas of the good, it relates to forms of ideology and stuff like that, rather than some inherent essentialization of their character, which prevents them from like understanding other people's positions and stuff like that. I think it's not so much that like you can't identify with things, it's that like it is an identification rather than an identity, right? Which sounds like a little bit of pedantry, I'm not gonna lie. Oh, this chat keeps jumping around. Sorry, everybody. Here we go. Another name. Will you have a Discord server or something similar? There's a accelerationist Discord server. It's not like my server. At least I don't see it as my server. So it's not like an Aldous Huxley server, but I can link it if you guys want. It's just a place to talk about accelerationism. Noah Watson. The idea of everything being economically determined is really depressing. Yeah, absolutely. And like I don't think Marx lauded this fact. Like he wasn't like, hooray, turns out we're all determined by material relations of production and stuff like that. It's actually pretty depressing when you think about it, but at the same time Marx was pretty optimistic about it, that he thought that once we became conscious of this fact, once we were rational of this element, that we can change it up a little bit. Greg Harmston, if you don't know the dancing guy, look up Terry A. Davis. Legit fascinating guy. He is absolutely brilliant. He single-handedly built his own operating system because God told him to. But he is unfortunately he's deceased. But he was very, very schizophrenic. Very interesting figure for sure. Watcher. To be honest, I'm a bit tired of what Marx actually meant discussions videos. Watcher, like there's this one guy making a 1-hour video explaining how socialism, communism distinction only arose after Marx, namely Lenin. Watcher, yes, but the novel meaning of it is useful, so what Marx meant. I think you are talking about Cuck Philosophy's video. I could be totally wrong. Because Cuck Philosophy recently did make a 1-hour or not, I don't know if it was a 1 hour video, but it was a very long video talking about socialism and communism and how they're the same thing. And personally, I don't like that reading of Marx. Because the thing about Marx, too, like, I would agree that I think the what Marx actually meant discussions get very tedious very quickly, because Marx didn't agree with himself throughout his whole project. Like, early Marx disagrees with late Marx, and the first volumes of Capital disagree with the later volumes of Capital. Like, to try to draw out, like, that Marx said the same thing the whole way through his project is totally not true. And it's the same thing like with land, right? Like, unless you're talking about a specific essay and being like, when Marx says A or X, you know, or when land says X, I sort of get suspicious, because it makes it seem like you haven't read enough to realize that they don't always agree with, you know, the essays don't always agree with one another. So I'm sorry if it slipped into that a little bit. I definitely wasn't trying to turn it into a let's all listen to what Marx has to say. Just more the faux Marxism on the left. There's a lot of faux Marxism on the left, and a lot of that faux Marxism comes down to saying, giant discussions of what Marx actually meant to explain away the difference between communism and socialism. And that being said, I love Cuck Philosophy. I think he's one of the better YouTube channels doing philosophy. Nothing against him. Yes, sorry, way, you missed the escape from the castle. It's all going up on the channel, though. You don't have to worry about that. Arato says you like the Fisher lectures. Good. There's at least one more of them coming. The chat keeps jumping around on me. It's so frustrating. Sorry, everybody. Watcher says, I am enjoying the Fisher lectures. Yes, but it's not enough out there for me. Yeah, I could have focused more on like the in there stuff, but I wanted to get to talking about Hegel and concrete versus abstract, and talking about universal positions through the negation of identity. So I tried to get into the weird stuff, but this is definitely one of Fisher's more normal sort of papers. So it maybe took a little bit of stretching to get there. Reading some essays from Fang Numina? Yeah, I could do that. Rojo40 brought that up. Oho Rojo40. Wait. F says, do a lecture on Thirst for Annihilation, so I have to read it in the Hermetics reading group. I haven't actually, like, I've read parts of Thirst for Annihilation, but I haven't read the whole book. So I would say the Hermetics reading group is a much better place to find that. Svet, another am I the philosopher, E-boy? I'm okay with that, I guess. I prefer the term theory cell, but I'm okay with philosopher, E-boy. Okay, so if you guys like this lecture, like I'll keep doing this type of format. And if you have any suggestions for like essays to read, anything like specific, as long as I feel confident enough doing a lecture on it, at least I'll definitely do it. Sorry, Oho Rojo. You had to deal with him dancing the whole time. I'm not taking him away. See, I'll find another gift to put at the bottom. But for today, we're dealing with Terry Davis. Who's faux Marx? Just look up like Marxists on Twitter. You'll see them. It was Flower that said that, by the way. I'm trying to get better at reading people's names before I read questions and reading them out loud and all that. I think that cookie vid determined your status in e-boy. Okay, I'm fine with that. If that's all it takes. It's too late. Another name. Could you do something about Nix's essays? Oh, that's an interesting one. I wouldn't mind reading the black paper, actually. I'd need to read it again and kind of go over exactly like what I wouldn't even... There's a lot to that paper, so I wouldn't even quite know what I'd go with right away. What is an e-boy? Can you do a lecture on that? No, apparently not. I didn't even know I was one. I thought I was a theory cell all along. Greg Harmson says Fisher's book Flatline Constructs has a lot of really interesting stuff on poetry, like Boris, cyberpunk, coffee materialism, some fair stuff. Yeah, Flatline Constructs is definitely one of the money, the money areas of Fisher's work. Like some of the stuff on hauntology, like I bought the book. What's it called? Ghosts of My Life, I think it's called, and there's so many essays that are like about like, you know, Joy Division or just very specific music that I'm not familiar enough to fully comprehend. But I would definitely recommend Flatline Contracts. I think that's just a good one for anybody to hop into if they're interested in this stuff. Yeah, okay, so I don't really have anything else to say. So unless there's any more questions... Okay, there's a couple more questions, I guess. Wait says, what anime do you watch? I don't watch much anime. I know it's surprising because I have a lot of anime on my channel. I feel like I like anime, but I just don't think that much anime is all that good. Like there's really a good handful of like 15, 20 animes I think are probably like really, really, really good, and then like most of them I just kind of like whatever. So what are some good animes? Serial Experiments Lane, Cowboy Bebop. I really like Monster. I thought Monster was a really, really good analysis of deontological ethics and like what it means. What's some other really good one? I really like Bacano. That was just a lot of fun. I don't know. I don't have a good list. Noah Watson asks, what is the point of gender identity if you only view things as economics? I don't know. What's the point of anything if you view like... And again, I think it depends what you mean by economics, right? Because if you're thinking about it as in just strict terms of what you might read in a bland economics textbook, it might not be quite correct. A better way to think about what Marx thinks about economics is like the material relations of production and consumption in society. How things are made, how they're distributed, how they are... like, very, very basic example, right? Part of the material reality of the Catholic Church is the ability that they had the wealth to build the Vatican. Like, you can't actually inherently, understand the Catholic Church if you didn't understand this massive influx of wealth and them building the Sistine Chapel. It's all related. You can't actually separate those two things out. And the Catholic Church today wouldn't be the same if they weren't able to build the Vatican. Like that's kind of what Marx is talking about when he's meaning identities are defined by economics. It's not necessarily that like you can learn everything from looking at a price breakdown, but that like inherently there is something materialist about those identities which found them. Post-punk is good shit. I agree, Svet. Post-punk is good shit. I don't know where that came from, but I'll agree. Cornelio James says, have you seen Neon Genesis Evangelion? I did. I don't want to alienate everybody, but I really didn't like it. I really didn't like Neon Genesis Evangelion. I'm sorry. Sorry, you can tear me apart. Svet asks, why do you call yourself Aldous Huxley? It's just a random name I gave the channel like before I even started doing philosophy videos on here. It's kind of incidental. But I like it. I like Aldous Huxley. It works. Another name is reminding me to do the teleoplexy video. And I'm reminding you that I'm doing these lectures to try to distract you guys. This is my sleight of hand to distract you away from the fact that it's been like months since the teleoplexy videos. Basically, the reason why I haven't done the teleoplexy video yet is like those first two videos, I basically like just put 6 months of my life into them. And like, I just ended up burning myself out really, really hard. And then like I looked at it and I was like, oh, I'm going to need to put in like at least another like few months into this. And then I just kind of like, okay, let's do some other videos and build my stamina back up. But I'm at the point now where I am working on the teleoplexy video. It is in production. It's coming. Just not anytime soon. No, Watson says I watch Akira because of your meme vid. Yeah, Akira is a great film. Like, I mean, even just aside from like anime. That's the thing about anime is like the anime that I like, I consider like good, even if it wasn't anime. Like it's the stuff that kind of like transcends the medium. I think that I appreciate. When I feel like I'm watching anime, when it's like fan service and stuff, I have a hard time. Paranoia Agent's really good too. Yeah, I use that in one of my vids. Thoughts on esotericism? Just like in general, like on being esoteric, or do you have like a very specific interpretation of esotericism? Yeah, I do like Acura. I like Ghost in the Shell. I like Lane. I like all that stuff. Like the pneumogram. Okay, so esotericism, I think just at its basic, like esotericism just basically means like hidden knowledge. Knowledge that here, let's see what Wikipedia has to say. Give me a sec. A term under which scholars have categorized mystery tradition. Okay, that's not a very good definition. Okay, let's try Merriam-Webster. The quality or state of being esoteric. Yeah, it pretty much just means like obscure. Not many people know about it. So like to the degree which things are esoteric just means like to the degree they're hidden, really. Like we often wouldn't think about things like Plato as being like esoteric, right? He's like the central figure of philosophy, Western philosophy. But then at the same time, like you read something like Parmenides and it's like, how could you think of a more, esoteric kind of dialogue? I don't know. I don't think it means all that much ultimately at the end of the day. It basically just means like whether people get it or not. Whether people ignore it. I haven't seen Technoanalyze Oreto, but I have certainly heard that I would like it. I'm going to watch it one day. I think it was... Technoanalyze was done by the same person who did Lane or something like that, too. Or... No, maybe it wasn't Lane. Maybe it was... I can't remember. Esotericism means magic that isn't cringe. Okay. I'll accept that. The video with Paranoia Agent is the Deleuze video. Intensity, virtuality, and the structure of time, part 2. Because there's that weird idea of the virtual becoming actual, and I thought that was a pretty good depiction of that, right? That this idea that she had literally becomes actual and starts affecting the real world. Sometimes my references for stuff are too esoteric. No one will fucking draw that out of it. Okay, so I guess that's it for today's lecture. Thank you all for being with me here. And I guess I will see you next Saturday when we look at Home is Where the Haunt Is. The third in our series of Fisher lectures. And as always, if you guys have any suggestions for further lectures, anything like that, let me know. If you have any questions, comments, if you want a different GIF at the bottom, let me know. And yeah, I'll do what I can. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.